On January 17, 1920, the United States government banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act were meant to clean the country up, cut crime, boost public health, and squeeze more productivity out of the workforce. A preacher named Billy Sunday staged a mock funeral for what he called John Barleycorn, telling the crowd that the reign of tears had ended, that slums would vanish, that prisons would turn into factories. None of it came true. What the ban actually created, within a single decade, was the most profitable criminal industry the country had ever produced, and it handed organized crime the startup capital, the organizational playbook, and the financial infrastructure that still powers the American underworld a century later. Before the ban, organized crime in the United States barely existed in any real sense. Street gangs operated small gambling dens, ran petty extortion schemes, and controlled low-rent prostitution in immigrant neighborhoods, and none of it paid especially well or required much coordination. These outfits fought over small territories that weren't worth much and earned just enough to stay alive. That changed the moment the government wiped out the fifth largest industry in the country overnight. According to the Bureau of Internal Revenue, Prohibition shuttered more than 200 distilleries, around 1,000 breweries, and over 170,000 liquor stores, which meant tens of thousands of jobs gone and entire supply chains destroyed in a matter of weeks. 75% of New York State's revenue had come from liquor taxes, and that money evaporated the day the law kicked in. Nationally, the federal government lost a total of $11 billion in tax revenue across Prohibition's 13-year run, while spending another $300 million trying to enforce it. That combined fiscal hit exceeded $11 billion in 1920s money, and that number doesn't even include the economic output lost when the legal alcohol industry collapsed, or the enforcement costs that landed on state and local governments. And here is what the drafters of the 18th Amendment never saw coming. Demand for alcohol did not drop. The amendment banned manufacturing, selling, and transporting intoxicating beverages, but it never banned possession or consumption. Tens of millions of Americans still wanted to drink and were willing to pay a premium to do it, which meant the gap between illegal supply and massive demand created a black market worth billions per year, and the only people positioned to fill that gap were criminals. The federal government put roughly 1,520 prohibition agents on the job, a number that eventually climbed to around 2,300 and later 3,000. Those agents had to patrol 12,000 miles of coastline, 3,900 miles of land border with Canada and Mexico, and keep tabs on 130 million citizens. The math never worked, and the gangs ran those numbers before the government did. 3 supply tiers kept the bootlegging economy running, each one operating as its own business with separate logistics, costs, and profit margins. The first tier was importation. Ships loaded with Canadian whiskey, Caribbean rum, and European spirits dropped anchor just outside the 3-mile jurisdictional limit off major coastal cities, forming floating liquor bazaars that journalists started calling Rum Row. The most notorious stretch sat off Atlantic City, New Jersey, where cargo moved onto custom-built speedboats fast enough to outrun Coast Guard cutters, which then ferried the product to shore-based distribution networks. North of the border, the operation ran even smoother. Distilleries across Ontario, Quebec, and the maritime provinces boomed during Prohibition, and whiskey flowed south across the Detroit River, wake across the Great Lakes on frozen ice in winter, and overland through dozens of unmonitored crossing points. Cleveland's Mayfield Road Gang ran speedboats across Lake Erie. The Purple Gang held the Detroit River Corridor, and New York's supply routes stretched all the way from the French islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon down to the Bahamas and Cuba. Domestic production made up the second tier. Moonshine stills ran in basements, barns, and backwoods across the country, while the federal government kept producing 170 million gallons of industrial alcohol per year for legitimate manufacturing, and a staggering amount of it got diverted for drinking. Washington's response was to poison the industrial supply through a process called denaturing, adding chemicals that turned the alcohol toxic. An estimated 10,000 Americans died from drinking denatured alcohol during the Prohibition years, and the government never stopped doing it. The third tier worked through legal loopholes baked right into the Volstead Act. Pharmacists could prescribe whiskey for medicinal purposes, and the number of registered pharmacists in New York State tripled during the era as a direct result. Religious congregations could buy sacramental wine, which produced a convenient uptick in church enrollment, and 22 million American households retained the legal right to ferment wine, beer, and cider at home for personal consumption. George Remus showed what a professional bootlegger looked like at the top of the game. A criminal defense attorney in Chicago, Remus spotted loopholes in the Volstead Act wide enough to drive a convoy through. Quit his law practice, relocated to Cincinnati, and started buying up distillery warehouses that still held millions of gallons of pre-Prohibition whiskey. He set up his own trucking company for transport and opened a pharmaceutical firm to distribute the product under the legal medicinal exemption. And at the height of the operation, Remus pulled in tens of thousands of dollars per day. Bootleggers from across the Midwest traveled to his guarded distribution center in Ohio around the clock. Nobody ran a bigger bootlegging operation than Al Capone. Chicago outfit boss Johnny Torrio took a bullet in an assassination attempt and retired in 1925, which handed control to Capone at 26 years old. What he inherited was a criminal organization, and what he built from it looked closer to a multinational corporation. Capone operated illegal breweries across Chicago and maintained a transportation network stretching into Canada for imported whiskey. And government estimates pegged the outfit's peak annual revenue at roughly $100 million, with about $50 million from bootlegging, $25 million from gambling, and $10 million from drugs and prostitution. Adjusted for inflation, that works out to between $1.4 and $1.5 billion in today's money. More than 600 gangsters worked for him across the city. Any bar or restaurant that turned down his liquor risked getting blown up, and as many as 100 people died for refusing his distribution network. The operation needed lawyers, accountants, brewmasters, boat captains, truckers, warehousemen, and armed enforcers the press nicknamed torpedoes. At that scale, bootlegging stopped being a criminal racket. It became a vertically integrated industry. Speakeasies formed the retail layer of the entire operation. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, an estimated 200,000 of them were running across the country, with New York City alone accounting for roughly 32,000, nearly double the number of legal saloons that existed before the ban. They operated out of basements, back rooms, and behind unmarked doors, and getting in required a password and connections. Prices ran steep because illegality inflated every markup, which meant the working class got priced out, while the wealthy and the politically connected drank without worry. One bootlegger told the Washington Post that 80% of congressmen and senators drank during Prohibition, and corruption sat at the core of the business model from top to bottom. Police, judges, and politicians collected regular payments from bootleggers who treated bribes the same way a legitimate business treats rent, as a fixed and predictable operating cost. Speakeasy owners paid the gangs for product, the gangs paid suppliers, importers, and producers, and everyone paid the officials who looked the other way. 7,000 bootlegging cases landed with the federal government in just the first 6 months, and within the first year of the Volstead Act taking effect, a study of 30 major cities found that crime had already jumped 24%. The experiment was collapsing almost from the start, and criminal infrastructure grew faster than anyone in Washington had imagined. Prohibition didn't just make criminals rich, it forced them to professionalize. Before the ban, gangs stayed small, ethnic, and territorial, running modest operations and scrapping over leftovers. Bootlegging profits on this scale demanded something new: real organizational structure with bookkeeping, logistics chains, payroll systems, and territory agreements. And the money ran so large that for the first time in American criminal history, ethnic barriers collapsed. Italians, Irish, Jews, and Poles found themselves working side by side because the revenue was too good to let old grudges get in the way. Arnold Rothstein spotted the opportunity before anyone else. A New York gambling boss remembered as the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. Rothstein became one of the earliest major investors in bootlegging and mentored an entire generation of future crime bosses, among them Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Oni Madden, and Waxy Gordon. He operated like an angel investor for organized crime, putting up startup capital, making business introductions, and drilling into his protégés the idea that illegal liquor distribution was not a street hustle, but a business that demanded the same discipline as any legal enterprise. Logistics, overhead, market share, return on investment, those were the terms Rothstein taught them to think in. A gambling debt got him murdered in 1928, but by then, the young men he'd trained were already running operations worth millions. And Luciano absorbed the lesson most completely. Cooperation across ethnic lines produced more money than ethnic loyalty ever could. The old Sicilian bosses, the ones the younger generation dismissed as mustache Petes, insisted on all Italian organizations bound by old-world codes, and Luciano saw those codes as a ceiling on growth. The bootlegging economy proved him right. Supply chains needed Jewish importers, Irish dock workers, Polish drivers, and Italian enforcers to function, and the money flowed to whoever delivered. Chicago's version of this played out in blood. The profits triggered a string of violent conflicts called the Beer Wars, with hundreds of gangsters killed as Capone's outfit. The North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion and later Bugs Moran, the Jenna brothers, these and a half dozen other factions fought over bootlegging territories. February 14th, 1929, marked the peak of that violence, when men dressed as police officers lined up 7 members of Moran's gang against a garage wall on North Clark Street and opened fire. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became the most notorious gang killing of the era and forced national pressure onto Chicago's political establishment. More than 1,000 people died in mob clashes in New York alone across the Prohibition years, and the national murder rate climbed from 6.8 per 100,000 to 9.7. That level of bloodshed couldn't last, and the man who understood that best was Charles Lucky Luciano. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, Luciano came to New York's Lower East Side as a child and climbed through the underworld during Prohibition, becoming a multi-millionaire bootlegger by his mid-20s. New York's Italian crime world was being consumed at the time by the Castellamarese War, a vicious power struggle between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano that claimed more than 60 lives between 1930 and 1931. Luciano played both sides. He secretly backed Maranzano and helped arrange Masseria's assassination at a Coney Island restaurant on April 15, 1931, and then less than 5 months later, on September 10th, he sent Jewish gunmen provided by Meyer Lansky, whose faces Maranzano's bodyguards had never seen, into Maranzano's own office to kill him. Both old-world bosses were dead, and what Luciano did next had never been done before. He abolished the boss of bosses title entirely, arguing that it painted a target on whoever held it and guaranteed future wars. What replaced it was the Commission, a governing body made up of the bosses of New York's 5 major crime families, plus representatives from Chicago and Buffalo, 7 members total. It operated like a corporate board of directors, voting on territory disputes, authorizing assassinations, settling conflicts by consensus, and coordinating operations across the country. Luciano referred to himself as chairman of the board, borrowing the language of corporate America to describe what amounted to a national crime syndicate. Jewish mobsters like Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Louis Lepke Buchalter, Dutch Schultz, and Longy Zwillman worked alongside the Italian families and sat in on meetings by design, not by accident. The first real test came in 1935, when Dutch Schultz announced he planned to murder Thomas Dewey. The New York prosecutor building cases against the mob. The commission voted it down, reasoning that killing a prosecutor would bring catastrophic heat. Schultz declared he'd do it regardless and walked out of the room. The commission ordered him killed. October 23, 1935, Schultz caught bullets in a Newark tavern and died the following day. The system worked exactly the way Luciano designed it. Luciano built the organizational architecture, and Meyer Lansky built the financial one. Born in what is now Belarus in 1902, Lansky arrived on the Lower East Side in 1911 and met Luciano as a teenager when Luciano tried to shake him down for protection money, and the two became lifelong partners. Lansky served as the mob's accountant, its chief financial officer, and the architect of its entire investment strategy. As early as 1932, He was routing bootlegging profits into Swiss offshore bank accounts, exploiting a Swiss secrecy law enacted in 1934 that made it nearly impossible for foreign governments to trace the money. Once Prohibition ended, Lansky redirected the syndicate's capital into gambling, building operations in Florida, New Orleans, and Cuba, where he arranged payoffs to dictator Fulgencio Batista and eventually controlled multiple casinos, including the Habana Riviera, the Hotel Nacional, and the Montmartre Club. He also bankrolled Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, a project originally budgeted at $1.2 million that ballooned to $6 million amid cost overruns and suspected skimming. When the other investors started suspecting Siegel was stealing, Lansky reportedly approved the order to have him killed in 1947. Castro's revolution wiped out Lansky's Cuban holdings in 1959, but by that point, the syndicate's money had already spread across Las Vegas, the Bahamas, and dozens of legitimate businesses. $300 million in hidden assets is what the FBI claimed Lansky possessed when he died in 1983. Lansky put the number at less than 35,000. 50 years of federal investigation never produced a conviction more serious than an illegal gambling charge that carried a 2-month sentence in 1953, and his New York Times obituary called him the financial wizard of organized crime. If you're finding this breakdown of criminal economics interesting, consider subscribing. We release new episodes every week covering the business models behind the world's biggest criminal enterprises, and every episode is sourced from court records, all law enforcement data, and verified reporting. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. $100 million a year in cash created an obvious problem for Capone. Where do you put it? Every dollar came from illegal activity. Every dollar arrived in currency, and the volume was far too large to spend without drawing attention. What Capone came up with became the template for every money laundering operation that followed. He bought cash-intensive businesses, laundromats, restaurants, nightclubs, and breweries, where illegal proceeds could blend with legitimate revenue in ways that investigators could barely distinguish. Inflated receipts from those front businesses made the dirty money look clean. The term money laundering is popularly traced to Capone's use of laundromats for exactly this purpose, though historians still argue about whether the connection is literal or apocryphal. Either way, and Capone also set up shell companies and installed nominee directors to hide his ownership interests in legitimate enterprises, building a wall between himself and his money that federal investigators would need years to dismantle. The breakthrough came through the tax code. A 1927 Supreme Court, ruling in the Manley-Sullivan case, established that income from illegal activity was taxable, and that claiming Fifth Amendment protection did not excuse a bootlegger from filing a return. That decision gave Elmer Eyre, head of the IRS enforcement branch, the legal ammunition he needed, and Eyre built a special intelligence unit of revenue agents and aimed them at Chicago's bootleggers. Agent Frank Wilson led the investigation that traced Capone's income through a web of front businesses and unreported transactions. Elliot Ness and his untouchables, a squad of Prohibition agents named for the fact that they couldn't be bought, built a parallel case targeting Capone's brewery operations, documenting 5,000 Volstead Act violations and securing 69 indictments. Prosecutors decided the tax case carried more weight. October 1931, Capone went down on 5 of 22 counts of tax evasion and received 11 years in prison plus a $50,000 fine, with his $13 million brewery business supplying the key evidence. That conviction drilled a lesson into organized crime that every major criminal enterprise has absorbed since. You can buy off police, corrupt politicians, and murder your competition, but the IRS is the one institution you cannot outrun. December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition. Mace and the mob's primary revenue source vanished overnight. Everything else survived. Organizational structures, capital reserves, corruption networks, multi-ethnic alliances, and labor relationships all stayed intact, and the mob simply diversified. Gambling came first, especially after Nevada had legalized it back in 1931. Lansky, Siegel, Moe Dalitz, Frank Costello, and others funneled bootlegging profits into Las Vegas casinos starting in the 1940s, which amounted to laundering Prohibition-era money through a legitimate industry. Labor racketeering expanded fast. The 5 families in the Chicago outfit moved into unions covering construction, the garment industry, garbage collection, trucking, and restaurants. By 1932, the president of the Chicago Crime Commission declared that Capone controlled 2/3 of the city's unions. The model ran like this: threaten employers with crippling strikes to shake them down, embezzle from union dues and pension funds, create employer cartels that steered work to mob-owned contractors, and lock down hiring halls to extract kickbacks from the workers themselves. Louis Lepke Buchalter took the garment district rackets in New York and turned them into a machine that pulled in between $5 and $10 million a year, the equivalent of $50 to $100 million today, from sweetheart contracts and kickbacks alone. The electric chair caught up with him in 1944 after a trucker he'd murdered threatened to expose the operation, when the New Deal tripled union membership from 3 million to 9 million. By the late 1930s, every single new member represented additional revenue for mob-controlled locals. The waterfront rackets run by the Genovese family, the Teamsters infiltration that persisted for decades, the construction industry cartels that piled billions onto the cost of building in New York City, all of it traced straight back to the capital, the organizational capacity, and the corrupt relationships that Prohibition had bankrolled. One Genovese crime soldier put it plainly to prosecutors years later: with the unions behind us, we could shut down the city, or the country for that matter, if we needed to get our way. The numbers explain why Prohibition collapsed as a law enforcement project. Start with what agents actually confiscated over the full 13 years. 1.6 million stills and other liquor-making devices, 9 million gallons of hard liquor, 1 billion gallons of malt liquor, 1 billion gallons of wine, cider, and mash, 45,000 cars, and 1,300 boats. Total value of seized property came to roughly $40 million, which adjusts to about $550 million in modern terms, and state and local authorities probably seized about the same amount. Agents hauled in roughly 577,000 suspects over the era, with prosecutors winning convictions from about 2 out of every 3. Those numbers look solid on paper right up until you consider what they couldn't stop. Hundreds of thousands of speakeasies, and millions of homebrewers smuggling routes that never shut down, a tidal wave of bribery, and the industrial-scale diversion of legal alcohol into the black market. Across 30 major American cities, crime jumped 24% between 1920 and 1921, the very first year of the ban. Police spending climbed 11.4%. Arrests for Prohibition violations surged 102%. Public drunkenness and disorderly conduct arrests rose 41%. Drunk driving arrests spiked 81%. And homicides and assaults ticked up 13%. Federal convictions ballooned by 561%. The federal prison population swelled 366%, and prison operating costs shot up more than 1,000%. The Wickersham Commission, which President Hoover appointed to investigate the enforcement disaster, determined that 2/3 of the entire federal law enforcement budget was going toward policing Prohibition. Fewer than half the states even funded their own enforcement operations, leaving the federal government to police laws that their own residents openly despised. Agents drew low wages, received minimal training, and fell to corruption at alarming rates, which forced the Bureau of Prohibition through repeated reorganizations. One assistant Treasury Secretary acknowledged that the conspiracies they faced were nationwide in scope, well-financed, and cleverly run. Courts buckled under the caseload. Defendants waited over a year for trial in many jurisdictions, and the plea bargain became standard practice in American law, largely because no other system could handle the volume. By 1929, speakeasies and illegal bars outnumbered the saloons that had existed before the ban by a factor of 2. Prohibition had not reduced drinking. It had pushed it underground and made it more expensive, more dangerous, and enormously more profitable for criminals. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who had originally championed Prohibition, wrote a public letter in 1932 conceding that he'd slowly come to accept that the experiment had failed. Drinking had generally increased, he admitted. The speakeasy had replaced the saloon, a vast army of lawbreakers had materialized, respect for the law had eroded, and crime had reached a level never seen before. The Great Depression, which hit in 1929, accelerated the push for repeal. The economy was crumbling, and the only people who appeared to be making money were bootleggers, which meant the government desperately needed the tax revenue that legal alcohol sales would produce. Jobs in brewing, distilling, and distribution would put Americans back to work. Franklin Roosevelt ran on a repeal platform in 1932 and won in a landslide. Congress proposed the 21st Amendment in February 1933, and the states ratified it on December 5th, making it the only constitutional amendment in American history enacted to undo a previous one. Tax revenue from legal alcohol started flowing again almost immediately, but the damage Prohibition left behind was permanent. Fragmented street gangs had become a nationally coordinated syndicate with corporate structure, diversified revenue, deep political connections, and capital reserves large enough to invest in legitimate industries. None of that evaporated when liquor went legal again. So some former bootleggers entered the licensed liquor business, but margins ran thin compared to what they had earned during the ban, and the real money had already migrated elsewhere. Luciano's commission kept operating for decades, with its last confirmed meeting taking place in 1985 following the murder of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. The 5 families that Maranzano organized and Luciano restructured still exist today, battered by decades of prosecution, but structurally descended from the organizations Prohibition created. The narcotics trade, which would become organized crime's next great revenue engine, was already being assembled by Luciano and others before the ban even ended. Heroin distribution networks, smuggling routes stretching from Europe and the Middle East, and street-level sales infrastructure all grew from applying the same logistics that had moved whiskey across borders for 13 years. Congress didn't pass the RICO Act, the law that finally armed federal prosecutors with the ability to charge criminal organizations as enterprises rather than picking off individual members, until 1970. That was 50 years after Prohibition spawned the very structures RICO was built to tear apart. Giuliani's civil RICO action against the Teamsters eventually shattered the mob's grip on that union, but only after decades of infiltration rooted in bootlegging profits from the 1920s. The McClellan Committee hearings of 1957 through 1960, which laid bare how deeply organized crime had burrowed into American labor unions, traced the roots of that corruption directly to the Prohibition era. And the public's distrust of unions that crystallized during those hearings has never fully recovered. Scholars still argue it contributed to the long decline in union membership that continues today. Prohibition stands as the clearest case study in criminal economics of what happens when a government bans a product that tens of millions of people want to buy. The market doesn't vanish. It transfers to whoever is willing to break the law, and the profits fund their expansion into industries that have nothing to do with the original product. $300 million is what the United States government spent trying to enforce Prohibition, and $11 billion is what it lost in tax revenue. The criminal organizations that the ban accidentally created went on to generate hundreds of billions across the era and the decades that followed. Every organizational innovation of American organized crime traces back to this period: the multi-ethnic syndicate, the commission, the corporate hierarchy staffed with lawyers and accountants, offshore money laundering through Swiss accounts, labor racketeering through union control, and the Las Vegas gambling economy that bootlegging capital built from scratch. Capone's $100 million operation ran like a corporation because it had to. Producing, transporting, and distributing illegal alcohol at industrial scale demanded the same management systems as any legal business. Lansky's financial innovations, Swiss accounts, casino investments, shell companies, and the careful separation of ownership from control still form the playbook for laundering criminal proceeds today. The bootlegging supply chain, with its importers, domestic producers, distributors, corrupt facilitators, and retail outlets, became the prototype for every criminal supply chain that followed, including the ones that we've covered in earlier episodes on this channel. The lesson is economic. Criminalizing a commodity with high consumer demand doesn't kill the market. It hands criminals a monopoly, funds their expansion into new industries, and generates collateral damage in the form of corruption, violence, and enforcement costs that dwarfs whatever harm the original product caused. 13 years is how long Prohibition lasted. A century is how long the criminal organizations it created have survived. The 18th Amendment was supposed to be a cure, and instead it became the single largest capital injection into organized crime in American history, building financial systems that are still collecting returns. The next time a government considers banning something that millions of people want, the answer is already written in the speakeasies, the offshore accounts, and the boardrooms of crime families that still carry the names of men who got rich selling whiskey in the 1920s. This has been The Crime Economics. If you made it this far, you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe, leave a comment telling us which criminal organization or financial scheme you want us to cover next, and I'll see you next week.